Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 624 for the 27th of September, 2020. Richard Saunders coming to you from Sydney, Australia. Let's have a look out the Skeptic Zone window. Sunny. A nice sunny day, not too hot. A good day for a long exercise walk later, I think, while I listen to some of my favourite podcasts. And I guess this pandemic has given me more time to do long walks and catch up with the swag, the collect. What's a group of skeptical podcasts called, I wonder? Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, the ESP podcast, Skeptoid, Geologic podcast, Squaring the Strange, Skeptics with a K, Tales from the Rabbit Hole, Oh No, Ross and Carey, Be Reasonable, Zealot, Rationable from India, and there's some more there, I'm sure. Hopefully you too are finding the time to catch up on all these wonderful podcasts from around the world, and each one of them in their own way will bring you a wealth of information. But what's coming up on the Skeptic Zone podcast this week? Life is Wild with Michelle Franklin. Ever seen a UFO? Many years ago, Michelle and her father did, and were quite baffled for a time. And more recently, she had the strange occurrence of a couple of red eyes peering at her from the darkness while camping. A slightly spooky start to this week's episode. Following Michelle's report, we dive once more into the treasure trove of Trove, the online resource from the Australian National Library. This week, we're going to look for references to the word Ouija, as in the Ouija board, or the Ouija board. How many poor Australians have been influenced by this demonic device over the decades? After that, it's the return of Michelle Bijkersma with Logical Fallacies. This week, Michelle's going to be looking at the Burden of Proof Fallacy. Don't believe me? Well, prove she's not going to do it. Then we have another edition of the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham, and Tim will be looking at Yetis, Yale, smuggling and shooting. And speaking of Tim Mendham, we're going to round off this week's episode with the newsletter Tim puts together every couple of weeks, the newsletter from Australian Skeptics. And speaking of Australian Skeptics, I have here the physical copy of the latest Skeptic magazine, the Journal from Australian Skeptics, Volume 40, Number 3, for September 2020. Sov Sits. Who are they? Why are they? Nullarbor UFOs, Wakefield, covert cranks, and much more. It's, 62 pages of information, reports, and what's this? Sometimes you just can't say no. Does the Australian Constitution give you the right to disregard inconvenient restrictions as part of COVID-19? Bruce Arnold looks at the fine print, so legal arguments about sovereign citizens and things like that. And I've made my own contribution to this edition with a story called COVID Clunkers. Richard Saunders presents a gallery of bad and dangerous claims. Now, this has been inspired by the website covidconspiracy.cloud. And if you go to skepticzone.tv, look at the show notes, you'll find a link to this website where you can upload your own COVID craziness. Always a good read. What's this? Cryptids and climate. Ben Radford contemplates the impact of climate change on animals that may not exist. Oh, that looks interesting. And don't forget you can subscribe to this magazine, have it delivered to your inbox, which is quite cheap, or the physical copy, which I have here in my hand as well. Just go to skeptics.com.au. On such a nice, bright, sunny day, I hope we can all find some time just to be happy, just to find a little bit of happiness. And I hope the Skeptic Zone brings you some entertainment and happiness along the way. But now it's time for me to run downstairs, and I'm going to have some pancakes, because yesterday I made my own pancake mix. and I bought some maple syrup. Well, I think it's fake maple syrup. Yeah, I know. I must look at the label. But this pancake mix I rather like because I always put an egg in the pancake mix. Some people do that. And I add chili flakes. Oh yes, my dear friend Jessica Singer, who is the president of the Australian Skeptics, from her own garden gave me some chili flakes. Jessica, I add those to the pancake mix. And while I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone.
Life is wild. With Michelle Franklin.
Hi guys, this is Michelle Franklin reporting from the Northern Territory. Today I want to tell you a story about the time that I saw a UFO. I would have been about 16, I think, because it was right before I got my license and my dad was driving me to band practice. It would have been about 6:30, I'm not exactly sure, but it was late enough that the sun had gone down and the sky was dark. As we were driving out of the driveway, we both looked up and we saw this massive, glowing, bright yellow ball of light in the sky. And we looked at it in surprise, and I don't really remember what we said to each other, but it was clear that we both assumed it was the moon, and we were just staring at it because it was ridiculously bright for some reason. And as we were looking at it and commenting on it, he drove out the driveway, and then I glanced to the side and I saw the actual moon somewhere else in the sky. And I'll never forget that moment of realization that the glowing ball wasn't actually the moon. I asked my dad what it was, and he didn't know, and neither of us knew what to do, so we just kind of stared at it. This was before phones had cameras in them, and I don't remember thinking about going back into the house to find a camera. I don't think we even told my mum and my sister what we saw. We just drove out towards this yellow ball. I don't think we were afraid, but I was definitely in awe of this unknown object that was hovering in the sky. I think I was running late for band practice as it was, and my dad asked if I still wanted to go, but we both agreed that following this weird glowing ball was way more important. It would have been at least 2 or 3 minutes, maybe even a whole 5 minutes that we drove towards this thing, and then it either moved or our perspective changed, but after a while it became apparent it was actually an end-on view of the Whitman's blimp. So it looked round from when we were looking at it, but when it turned sideways we could see that it was actually blimp-shaped. Now I've told this story to lots of people because I think it's the only time that I've ever actually truly believed that I was witnessing something paranormal. I think it was around the time that the Independence Day movie with the alien invasion came out, and I do remember thinking that the whole world was about to change and I was witnessing the beginning of something big and significant, and reality was about to shift. Now, when I think back to that moment, I tell myself that this is proof that I am in fact open-minded, because when I thought I was witnessing real evidence for alien invasion, or at least visitation, I was willing to believe it. This was at least 20 years ago now, and for most of my life, this has been the only example that I have of witnessing something that I couldn't reconcile as fitting into the world that I understand. That was until a few weeks ago when I got to test my courage and convictions again. This time it happened when I was alone. I was camping in a dried out swamp with a group of people that I didn't know very well, so we all set up our sleeping areas fairly separate and isolated from one another, and I was absolutely certain that there was nobody near me when I walked back to my mozzie net. It was also my first time sleeping without a tent or a swag, so I was a little bit outside my comfort zone, and I just had a little lightweight mozzie net strung up between two trees and a sheet of canvas on the ground. It was less than what I'm used to, but I still felt pretty safe. And I crawled underneath the net to get into my little sleeping space, and I got myself all set up and blew up my inflatable pillow ready to sleep. And then when I switched off my torch and looked around, immediately I saw these two what looked like red eyes that were about a metre away from me and about half a metre above the ground. Just two little points of red light. They looked kind of slightly flattened, like the way eyes are. Yeah, I didn't know what they were. They just looked like these slightly flattened horizontal lines about 2 centimetres apart, and I just stared at them for a good few minutes trying to figure out what they were. And I remember thinking that they looked like a single red light that was reflected in a double glass door, but of course there was no glass nearby. And I thought through all the gear that I'd brought with me, and the only light that I had was my head torch, which was in my hand at the time, and my phone, which was in my bag. So I was actually really impressed with my own reaction, because within seconds of seeing the glowing dots, my mind immediately invented some small alien figure to go with them. And I wasn't afraid of it. I thought through all the options that it might be, and I couldn't come up with any explanation for what it was. And I did get a kind of an adrenaline rush as I sat there and watched these glowing dots. I don't even know if I looked around to see if there were more of them. I just remember watching these dots to see if they blinked or moved at all. And of course they didn't. I think it would have been at least 2 or 3 minutes that I watched them with my torch in my hand and available, but I deliberately didn't turn it on until I was absolutely sure that I couldn't figure out what it was. And eventually I did turn the torch on and realised that it was my thermocell, which, if you don't know what a thermocell is, it's this little device that it runs on a little gas bottle, and it heats up a metal plate with a pad that releases an insect repellent. So it's just a little insect repellent device, but it had a glowing ember inside it, which normally when you look up close it's blue, but apparently from a distance it glows red with there's a little dark patch in between, so it looked like 2 glowing red dots. There you have my 2 instances of seeing something completely out of place in my worldview, and my 2 reactions. At 16, my response was to believe that it was aliens and still drive towards it and try to learn more. And then now at 38, my response was to sit less than a metre away from the potential danger and just watch it without cheating and using the torch that I had available the whole time. I've got no idea if these are good reactions, but I feel like in a world where aliens are either non-existent or really far away, I handled the situations pretty well. But in a world where demons and monsters and supernatural dangers exist, I might not fare too well. But so far my responses haven't killed me. The only other similar situation I can think of is the regular occurrence of my dog barking in the night. I live in an isolated house surrounded by bushland, so there's no neighbours or passing cars for her to bark at. So when she barks, I usually assume she's smelled or heard an animal nearby. And in almost every circumstance, my response is to walk out into the darkness to investigate, leaving the door open behind me. I once stepped out of my kitchen door and over the snake that was lying on the doormat as she was barking at it. Luckily for me, it was non-venomous and it didn't bite me, but maybe I should reconsider the whole walk towards the danger response that my curiosity seems to have led me to, or at least turn the light on before I leave the house. But I don't mind being the cliche skeptic. Friends have told me that the stories of things that they've seen in the dark and the supernatural explanations that they have for them, but I always tell them that there's no need for them to be afraid, because whenever the monsters attack, it's always the overconfident skeptic that gets eaten first. But I'm looking forward to the next time that I see something unexplainable. I wonder what my response will be that time.
I started listening to Ono, Ross, and Carrie shortly after I broke my arm, and the doctor had told me I'd never walk again.
Ross and Carrie.
Ona Ross and Carrie is just a podcast. It doesn't do anything. It's just sounds you listen to in your ears. All these people are made up. Goodbye.
Now we continue our interesting trip in our time machine through the pages of Australian newspapers and periodicals and journals, magazines, archived at Trove, trove.nla.gov.au. In the past, we've been looking for yowies and clairvoyance and UFOs. But this week, I thought we'd look for listings or articles with the word Ouija. Now, the Ouija board is a classic of spiritualism and mysticism and psychic goings-on, as you probably well know. It's the large board with letters and numbers on it, and a device called a planchette, which is a pointing device that's placed on the board, and 4 or 5 people put their fingers on this planchette, and mysteriously the planchette will move and spell out letters or indicate numbers or things like this, yes, no. And it's long been realized that this is all part of the ideomotor action, where people will subconsciously direct the planchette. And it's quite interesting when there are 4 or 5 people working together without realizing it to make the planchette move around. Although I must admit, I did go to one event in a graveyard where there was a Ouija board, and nothing was really happening until a certain person came along from the ghost hunting party, and suddenly the Ouija board started to spell out all sorts of things. So make of that what you will. So searching for the word Ouija, which is O-U-I-J-A, which it said it's the combination of the words for yes in French, oui, and German, ja, Ouija. And probably it's referred to as a Ouija board somewhere along the way. Anyway, now our search continues, and we land in the year 1944, the 31st of December, and the Sunday Times from Perth, Western Australia. The Ouija comes back in America. In spite of airmail and V-mail, I wonder what V-mail is, I might look that up. Many Americans have sought the aid of the Ouija as a speedy and exciting method of wartime communication. In the first 6 months of 1944, one New York department store alone sold more than 50,000 Ouija boards to customers. Demand in the previous year was only small. The Ouija board, created in 1892, did not win notoriety until the First World War. The Ouija itself, the name is derived from the French oui and the German ja, both meaning yes, is a flat board the size of a breakfast tray. Across it are written the alphabet, the numbers from 1 to 10, and words yes and no. 2 players face each other, the board resting upon their knees. Their fingertips are placed lightly on the edges of a small heart-shaped piece of wood, the planchette, mounted on 3 legs. When a question is asked, this cordate frame moves about the board, stopping at certain letters and numbers, spelling the words of the answer. Its inventors, William Flood, a Baltimore toy manufacturer, and his brother Isaac, explained when they applied for a patent that after a question is asked, the involuntary muscular action of the players, or sometimes other agency, will cause the frame to commence to move across the table. Ouija addicts ignore this muscular interpretation and stick for explanation to the other agency. And although scientists have discovered that the planchette's erratic activities are frequently due to the thought transference of one of the players, staunch supporters won't admit such materialism. The Ouija, to them, is spiritualistic, even if patented. Today, as in 1918, planchette patronizers tell of the Ouija's prophecies of the world situation. Occasionally, Ouija exhibits a tremendous and profound vocabulary. Others have a pluckish sense of humor. One board after being plagued at length over a simple question, reported, "What morons you are! Why don't you use some sense?" Another, at 2 a.m., after a grueling session, is said to have spelt out excitedly, go to bed. I'm sick of this." Now that is an interesting report from the Sunday Times in 1944. And now our search brings us to the pages of the Canberra Times in 1975. The 14th of August, on page 13, we see concern over occult dabbling. Ouija board use led to haunting. Sydney, Wednesday. Strange noises, flying objects, and broken windows mysteriously occurred in a Sydney house after a woman began using a Ouija board. An independent witness saw a knife, a plate, an ashtray, and a cake of soap fly through the air. But after a prayer in the house for the removal of a spirit, the mysterious manifestations disappeared. The case of the house possession by an unseen presence is detailed in the report of an Anglican Commission of Inquiry into the Occult, established by Archbishop of Sydney, the Most Reverend Marcus Lone. Last year, the Commission reported widespread fascination with the occult among young people throughout Australia. It recommended a ban on the sale of Ouija boards, tarot cards, and occult material sold in newsagents and toy shops. House was possessed, and it called for government control to ensure that harmful books on the occult could not fall into the hands of minors. In its report, the Commission said the case of the haunted house occurred in a suburb on the outskirts of Sydney while the inquiry was being concluded. Completely independent witnesses, including a police officer, reported unexplainable noises, flying objects, and apparent attempts by an unseen presence to force the residents out of the haunted house. One witness told the Commission the trouble began after a woman living in the house began to ask questions of a Ouija board. Strange noises were heard in the house at night, and the police were called on several occasions to find their source. A witness told the Commission, "At first I was sceptical, thinking the noises were caused by the mother or her children or neighbouring children. But after examining the house from top to bottom with a friend, we found there could be no explanation other than the house was possessed. Things started to happen while we were there. We saw a knife fly through the air, a plate, an ashtray, a cake of soap flew through the air and broke a window." The Commission found evidence that many thousands of young people and troubled people had been led into a deep fascination and reliance upon astrology, Ouija board questions. This fascination has in some cases led to a kind of fatalism, reading every occurrence as something foreordained by the movement of the stars and outside human control, it said. Such an attitude can lead to a loss of any sense of responsibility for personal actions. But much more serious was the delving into the world of Satan through necromancy and fortune-telling, possession by demons, calling up the dead, once a party trick, was today considered an important commitment which governed the lives of many people. The Commission believed the devotion to necromancy has developed alarmingly. In some cases, children have been encouraged to become mediums, and the lives of whole family groups have been dominated by seances and Ouija board forecasts, it said. Sometimes serious psychiatric disorder has followed. The final and worst result of dabbling with the occult for some people was demonic possession. That phenomenon was now being recognized by some psychiatrists as a unique illness, one which could only be cured by exorcism properly carried out by persons who knew what they were doing. The Commission said it was unnecessary to appoint diocesan exorcists. but every parish clergyman should be aware of the ways of helping those who got involved with the occult. And the story continues. Student interest. Sydney, Wednesday. Half of Sydney's high school students have had dealings with the occult and Satanism, and a quarter of the students say something of a violent nature has occurred at seances they have attended. The findings parallel surveys in Adelaide and Brisbane, which found that some students became deeply involved in witchcraft and black masses. The report of the inquiry said an Adelaide survey found that more than half of high school students had been to a seance. Some were deeply involved in witchcraft, black magic, and black masses in cemeteries. A Brisbane survey reported on bad psychological effects from dabbling in the occult. These findings were backed up by a poll of 965 Sydney high school students by the Commission as part of its report. Half the students believed in Satan and had played at contacting spirits. Half had attended seances, though they had been warned they were dangerous. On the average, female participation was almost twice as high as male participation. And finally, on the same page, so remember this is from the Canberra Times 1975, we have the story, Tarot Cards Out of Demand, with a picture of a Ouija board at the top, a Ouija board now said in Sydney to be out of demand. Sydney, Wednesday. Sydney toy shop proprietors and wholesalers reported today that both tarot cards and Ouija boards were out of demand and out of stock. The sales manager of a leading Sydney toy wholesaling and importing business, Mr. Merv Anyclimb, said locally made Ouija boards went out of stock about 2 years ago. There was a call for them about 2 years ago when they were selling for about $4 or $5, but that's died down, he said. It's a game playing the Ouija board. I don't agree with what the Anglican Church inquiry has stated. I don't think they're any more dangerous than any other game. You could have a shooting over a game like Monopoly, just like you could over many other games. Mr. Peter Borum, a toy dealer, said his wholesaler had not had tarot cards available for the last 12 months. They were imported anyway, and weren't good sellers, he said. Mostly adults bought them, but never any children. Mrs. Kay Steen of the Toy Villa, Rose Bay, said tarot cards were a popular fad about 3 years ago when a James Bond film, which showed tarot readings, came to Sydney. And that would have been Live and Let Die with Roger Moore. We had a lot of people then coming in with requests for a game which was put out after the film, and it contained tarot cards inside the box, she said. But personally, and not for religious reasons, I'm against tarot cards or Ouija boards being sold in toy shops. I don't think they're what you could call toys. They would be better off sold in a trick or magic shop. If I were offered them as part of a sales line, I'd refuse point blank. So there we are, and those are but a few of the reports that were returned when I typed in the word Ouija into the search engine. In fact, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of references going back decades, but I think those ones from 1975 are quite interesting. So once again, the treasure trove, that is Trove, is at your fingertips. All you need to do is go to www.trove.nla.gov.au, type in your search, and away you go.
Hello, this is Rob Palmer. You may have heard of me. Lately, I've been interviewing scientists, skeptics, and other critical thinkers from around the world for my column in the Skeptical Inquirer, and recently, some for the Skeptic Zone. My written interviews have included Jay Novella from The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, mass psychogenic illness expert Robert Bartholomew, Celestial Ward from Squaring the Strange, psychic busting Private Eye Bob Nygaard, skeptical activist Michael Marshall of the UK, and even secular activists Bailey Harris and Jean Delancey, that's Q from Star Trek. I even interviewed, believe it or not, a magic dragon, and another really well-known skeptic, Richard Saunders. You can find my online column with these interviews and more by Googling The Well-Known Skeptic plus Skeptical Inquirer. Also, follow me on Facebook at The Well-Known Skeptic. Cheers!
Logical fallacies. What are logical fallacies, and why is it important that critical thinkers should know about them? A logical fallacy is an error we can make in reasoning, but it usually crops up when we are discussing or arguing our point of view. Some people might even knowingly use them to try and score cheap points in an argument due to intellectual laziness. They are traps we can fall into, but if we know what to look out for, we can spot them when they occur and stop ourselves from using them. This time, we'll look at the burden of proof fallacy.
This is when, instead of presenting evidence to support your claim, you insist that the person doubting it prove your claim to be false.
This tactic, which can seem reasonable to the one committing the fallacy, is heard again and again in skeptical investigations. It's a sort of get out of jail free card and gives the person making the claim a quick way to appear to stump the skeptics, particularly by asking the skeptic to disprove something instead of providing evidence to support the claim being made.
I'll never forget the night I was abducted by aliens. I was driving in the countryside when they beamed me up to their spaceship. 2 hours later, I was back in my car. No one, from police to so-called skeptics, have been able to prove it didn't happen.
This situation is very familiar to skeptical investigators. If the person in question had more to the claim than just his story, maybe a fragment of alien technology, he wouldn't need to worry about others not being able to disprove it.
This new drug to fight coronavirus is just amazing. It's all natural and made from a rare moss only found in the Amazon. I've seen it work for myself, and unless the government can prove otherwise, it must be rolled out as soon as possible.
No matter how appealing it is to think a new drug or even a modality of alternative medicine works, it must first go through the rigorous scientific trials and tests to show it does in fact work. That's where the burden of evidence lies. And by the way, any alternative medicine that does pass scientific trials and tests, that is actually shown to work, is no longer called alternative medicine. It's called medicine.
I had an amazing reading with a medium who contacted the spirit of my dead grandmother and told me things only she would know. How can you prove that it wasn't really her coming through?
Ultimately, no one can prove the medium didn't contact the dead grandmother. But then again, no one can prove it wasn't another spirit pretending to be the grandmother, or a tricky alien from another dimension pretending to be the grandmother, and on and on. What we can do, if the reading was recorded, for example, is to walk the person through what was said, pointing out the cold and hot reading tricks that may have been used. Remember that the burden of proof always lies with the one making the claim, and asking them for evidence is an entirely reasonable request. While it is possible sometimes to indeed prove something didn't happen, Many times it is not. But that alone does not mean the claim is real. As Dr. Carl Sagan famously said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Knowing a logical fallacy when you hear one, and even knowing its name, is important when arguing your point of view. However, you may come across as arrogant and not get very far if you call it out by name to your opponent when you hear it being used. If your opponent calls you out for using one, it's time to stop and think about how you are making your case. Use your knowledge of logical fallacies wisely, and remember that even if your point of view is right and you know all the pitfalls in arguing your case, it doesn't always mean you'll win on the day. And as skeptics, we must also remember that we too can be wrong at times. I'm Michelle Bijkersma from the Vic Skeptics. Thanks for listening.
Appearing at Skepticon 2020, the Australian Skeptics National Convention, Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki. Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki just loves science to pieces. His media career spans more than 30 years, talking about science in radio, TV, podcasts, newspapers, and books, 45 to date, with more on the way. His accolades range from the Ig Nobel Prize from Harvard University for his groundbreaking research into belly button fluff and why it is almost always blue, to being one of Australia's 100 national living treasures. In 2019, the United Nations awarded Dr. Karl the UNESCO Kalinga Prize for the popularisation of science. The prize is a global recognition of Dr. Karl's gift for communication. He is the first Australian to win the prize. A lifetime student, Dr. Karl has degrees in physics and mathematics, biomedical engineering, medicine and surgery. He has worked as a physicist, labourer, roadie for bands, car mechanic, filmmaker, biomedical engineer, TV weatherman and medical doctor at the Children's Hospital in Sydney. Since 1995, he has been the Julius Subner Miller Fellow at the University of Sydney, where his mission is to spread the good word about science and its benefits. Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki, just one of the speakers at Skepticon 2020, the Australian Skeptics National Convention. For more information and tickets, visit www.skepticon.org.au. And now, a reading from the Book of Tim with Tim Mendham.
Hi, my name's Tim Mendham. I'm the Executive Officer for Australian Skeptics Inc. and I'm editor of our magazine The Skeptic. And today's Book of Tim is coming from The Skeptic, June 2018, which is volume 38, number 2. And I'm reading from the regular column called What Goes Around, which starts off at a certain particular fact or set of facts and makes its way through associated facts until it ends up where it started from, which shows that all knowledge is connected and connectable. And this time, I'll be looking at Yetis, Yale, smuggling and shooting. In 1957, the government of Nepal issued regulations limiting interaction with Yetis, known locally as Meitei, man-bear. In 1959, the US Foreign Service reissued these regulations in a memo titled Regulations Governing Mountain Climbing Expeditions to Nepal, relating to Yeti. The Nepalese government basically wanted 5,000 rupees for a permit to carry out an expedition in search of Yeti. The Yeti can be, quote, photographed or caught alive, but it must not be killed or shot at except in an emergency arising out of self-defence. and news and reports throwing light on the actual existence of the creature must be submitted to the government of Nepal and must not in any way be released to the media without permission. This is largely because the previous decade had seen a flurry of activity, but the history of Yeti hunting by foreigners goes back a long way. In the late 1890s, explorers in Nepal, who used to have to pose as religious pilgrims, started reporting on the beast. In 1921, the Everest reconnaissance expedition noted strange tracks in the snow. A journalist for the Calcutta Statesman interviewed the porters for that expedition. He mistranslated Meitei to mean filthy and coined the term abominable snowman. In the 1950s, Eric Shipton, attempting Everest, took the first pictures of Yeti tracks. In 1953, Edmund Hillary came across strange tracks during his successful ascent of Everest with Tenzing Norgay. Tracks, and even the creature itself, were regularly cited as more and more Westerners made their attempts on the tallest mountain in the world. In 1954, the UK Daily Mail funded a 16-week snowman expedition to Everest to look for clues. But the really big Yeti hunter in the late 1950s was American oil millionaire and cryptozoology enthusiast Tom Slick, who lived from 1916 to 1962. Slick's eccentric life would frankly make a great film. In fact, one was first announced in 1996, titled Tom Slick Monster Hunter, with Nicolas Cage in the title role. But it has been in development hell, as they call it, ever since. Slick's father, Tom Slick Sr., was known as Dry Hole Tom for his significant lack of success in oil prospecting. He finally did hit pay dirt, but died young, leaving a vast fortune to his family, thus funding Tom Jr.'s exciting adventures. Tom Slick Jr. attended Yale, expanded the family business, co-established the first cargo air freight service, poured money into scientific philanthropy. He supported the Southwest Research Institute, started the Mind Science Foundation to explore strange consciousness and mental powers, and campaigned for world peace. While in India, he met a man who could seemingly levitate and teleport himself. Slick thought that levitation could be a huge boon to the construction business. As an aside, when Slick's father died, his mother married Slick's former partner, who had previously been married to Slick Sr.'s sister. This man was kidnapped by Machine Gun Kelly and coined the term G-Men for the FBI agents who rescued him. Okay, back to Slick. Slick Jr. was obsessed with searching for cryptids. He travelled through Nepal looking for the Yeti, but without much luck. Following an injury in a bus accident, his mother insisted he stayed home. And from then on, he funded expeditions rather than participated. One such was to acquire the Pangosh hand, which legend had was a mummified Yeti hand from a Buddhist monastery. He convinced the actor Jimmy Stewart to smuggle some fingers from the hand to England in Mrs. Stewart's lingerie case. Special effects company Weta Workshop, co-founded by film director Peter Jackson and who made Lord of the Rings, later made a facsimile for the monastery. Unable to return to Nepal, Slick concentrated on searches for Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest of the USA. During his initial searches for the Yeti, he had wanted to shoot one, but gradually changed his mind to only photographing the beast. Not that he ever did. He died in a plane crash aged 46. Since then, several jurisdictions have specifically outlawed shooting Bigfoot, beginning with Skamania County in Washington, which declared the area a Sasquatch refuge. California and Oregon followed suit. Slick was born in Texas, so it is ironic that the Chief of Staff of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Law Enforcement Division said in 2012 that it is legal to kill Bigfoot, since it isn't listed by the state as a game animal, nor is it an endangered animal, unlike the government of Nepal. Which brings us back to where we started. It's What Goes Around from the Skeptic, June 2018. And you can read The Skeptic on our website, skeptics.com.au. Look back for 39 years of past issues. And I'm sure you'll enjoy them. And once you've done that, you'll subscribe to the magazine, won't you?
The Skeptic, the journal from Australian skeptics. Subscribe online to the world's second oldest skeptical magazine. Just visit www.skeptics.com.au and click the magazine link. There you will also find, free to download, almost 40 years of back issues. The Skeptic, the journal from Australian skeptics, available as a physical copy or as a digital copy delivered to your inbox. Now it's time to check in once again with the Australian Skeptics via their newsletter, Newsletter 106. And this is compiled by Tim Mendham, and it starts, "Hi all. The ongoing saga, that is the COVID pandemic, is distressing enough, even for those areas where infection rates are low. But the vision of irrational conspiracy theorists putting the population at increased risk because of their selfishness and paranoia is just plain infuriating, if not also perplexing." And it says, have a look at this sample article from The Skeptic for a story of just some of those who drag in woo and misinformation to further their campaigns. And that is a link to a PDF which brings you some pages of the current Skeptic magazine, a feature article, Sovereign Citizens, ID Naysayers. Tim Mendham looks at self-appointed experts and Karens and Kevins of the anti-COVID brigade. So that's there for you to read if you so wish. In fact, I will link to that in this week's show notes. But the newsletter goes on. Okay, it's still only a relatively small number of people, but it makes you wonder if a Lord of the Flies scenario, where society's veneer of civility and reason can collapse so easily and quickly, is just lying around the corner. Skeptics have always known that there is a layer of woo merchants and their followers in every society. If it weren't so dangerous, seeing them expose themselves so readily would just be plain sad. Thank heavens for ghost stories and psychic horses to brighten up our days. Read on. We shall read on. The first item here reminds us all about the Skepticon convention coming up October the 24th to the 25th at skepticon.org.au. And then we move along to Australian Skeptics' $2,000 prize for critical thinking in the media. Australian Skeptics is once again offering an annual award for skeptical journalism. The Barry Williams Award for Skeptical Journalism recognises the best piece of journalism in any medium that takes a critical and skeptical approach to a topic that falls within our remit, which is the scientific investigation of pseudoscience and the paranormal. It is awarded annually with a citation and $2,000 prize. The first award was given in 2018 to News Limited journalist Jane Hansen, and the second in 2019 to Liam Mannix of The Age and Sydney Morning Herald. We're calling for nominations from Skeptic, the public and the media. Journalists can nominate their own work. The item or items nominated should have been published, posted or broadcast between December 2019 and September 2020 inclusive. Nominations can be sent to the editor of The Skeptic at editor@skeptics.com.au. The deadline is October 11, so there's a call. Those of you in Australia in the media, or if you've read a particularly good critical journalism in the last year, then this could well be a way for the journalist to pick up a $2,000 prize. The next item says, Ayurvedic healer banned in interim order. The New South Wales Healthcare Complaints Commission has given an 8-week interim prohibition order to an Ayurvedic healer, Rama Prasad, while it investigates his prescribing of the Ayurvedic medication Manasamitra Vatika to both children and adults, and about his claims that his treatments can reverse several aspects of autism in children. The medication was found to contain elevated levels of lead and other heavy metals. And there's more about that story there. The next story discusses convictions based on hypnosis allow for the miscarriage of justice. A good discussion on the use of hypnosis by police and courts in the US. This article links to another that looks at repressed memory and the problems with eyewitness evidence. Then we have our next item here. It says Skeptic winner filmmaker becomes co-author on paper in Science. In an unusual turn of events, Melbourne-based filmmaker Sonia Pemberton, who won the Skeptics Thornet Award for the promotion of reason in 2013, has just become a co-author on a paper that has just been published in the top international journal, Science. And the next item says Scientific American argues against Trump. In an unprecedented step, science publication Scientific American has launched a scathing attack on President Donald Trump and endorsed his opponent, Democratic candidate Joe Biden, in the upcoming US election. It's the first presidential endorsement in the magazine's 175-year history. This has naturally raised some criticism from Trump supporters, though some seem to misunderstand the differences between a learned society and a scientific publication. And there are some more stories here about COVID-19, and then we have a picture of the cover from the very latest issue of The Skeptic, the journal from Australian Skeptics. And it says the September 2020 issue of The Skeptic, pictured above, has hit the streets. The digital version, already in people's virtual hands, the hard copy in the post this week. It includes a major feature on the current trend in refuseniks, sovereign citizens, freemen of the land, those who harass retail staff to prove how free they are and their ilk. The history, the constitutional issues, the legal and health impacts, who they are and why they do it. Plus the usual panoply of the interesting and the weird, the worrisome and the fun, including a major retrospective of one of Australia's premier UFO encounters. And to round off, they have a few of the upcoming events. October the 1st, Sydney Skeptics in the Pub with our guest Ben Radford. October the 19th at the Skeptics Cafe in Victoria, Dr. Mark Newbrook. Cancel culture, the Skeptics, tribalism and free speech. And more links to Canberra Skeptics, Gold Coast Skeptics, Queensland Skeptics, Adelaide Skeptics and more. That's the Australian Skeptics Newsletter, and you can have that delivered into your inbox every couple of weeks. And to sign up, just visit www.skeptics.com.au. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone this week, and thank you to Michelle Franklin, Michelle Bijkersma, and Tim Mendham for your segments on the show. Coming up on next week's show, hopefully another Logical Fallacy from Michelle Bijkersma, another segment from the Book of Tim, but I don't want to give too much away, but we should have a very interesting interview coming your way next week on the show. I don't want to say too much at the moment, but it's to do with some shenanigans in the anti-vaxxer world. Also soon on the Skeptic Zone, maybe even next week too, we're going to be interviewing an old friend of mine, Klaus Larsen from Denmark, who runs a really good conspiracy theory website. Lots of good information. Thank you, as ever. Thank you to those people who subscribe to the Skeptic Zone at skepticzone.tv via Patreon or PayPal. And with the Australian dollar not doing so well, it's dipping a little bit, which means that every month when the Patreon money comes through especially, it operates in my favor because of the poor state of the dollar. That's if you are subscribing in US dollars, which many people do. And if you're not a subscriber to the show, please keep listening, please keep enjoying it, and send a thank you card to those people who do subscribe, because it's due to those people that you are hearing the Skeptic Zone. Thank you, people. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Hello to the afterthoughts, the people who keep listening after the music. If you've never heard the show before and you don't know why you're hearing me now because the show's over, this is the part of the show that sometimes, it's like an Easter egg. We roll a 10-sided die, usually, sometimes a 6, sometimes a 30. In the past, I've got a whole box of them. So anyway, 10 is a good number. And you use your predicting magical, special predicting powers. You can peer into the future if you like, which is the past, because I'm about to record this, which is in my... This is like these Einstein relativity mind experiments. Okay, so I'm about to do this, so it's in the future. There's no question. I don't know what numbers are going to come up. But by the time you hear this, of course, it would have been in the past. Or it is in the past. It has happened. It's yet to happen, but it has happened. But even though it has happened and the results are a fait accompli, you don't know what the results are. This is like Schrodinger's dice, isn't it? Should devote a whole episode to this. Anyway, stop waffling. I'm going to roll this die 3 times, and you use whatever powers you like to predict what numbers are going to come up. Here we go. Shaking it in my hand now. First number is 10. All right, write that down on the Skeptic Zone pad with my Skeptic Zone pen. Well, they're just a pad and a pen, really. Okay, next one. So first number is 10. Next number is 7. All right. Last number coming up is 10. Oh, there you go. 10, 7, 10. And just for the hell of it, I'm going to go back here to my box of dice, and I'll get out the big guns. Here we go. What's this? This is a 30. A D. I think I've got a D60 somewhere. Believe it or not. Okay, here we go. This is a big die. This one. D30. A number from 1 to 30, and the number it's come up on is 27. So, this week's winning numbers are 10, 7, 10, and 27. Hang on a second. Wait a minute. The total of the first 3 numbers on the D10 equals 27. And the number rolled on the D30 is 27. Ooh, spooky. What do you think, Skeptic Zone cats? They don't seem impressed.